Welcome to the GSMC Pets Podcast, the show that caters to pet lovers of all kinds. We'll talk about pets on social media, pets doing amazing things, and how to take care of the pets in your life. Whether your pet is a dog, a cat, a llama, hamster, reptile, or something more exotic, you'll find educational and entertaining information on the GSMC Pets Podcast.
For tuning in to the GSMC Pets Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Once again, I'm your host, Alex Fletes. So if you guys know me well enough, you know that I love animals who do unique things, especially animals with cool abilities or animals who just are surprising in some of the things they do. Because of that, I wanted to share animals that do something really fun and something that you don't see very often, but if you're on social media, you might. And that's animals who are doing things like people. And why they might do that, and why it's so much fun to get to see something like that happen. So, sit back and enjoy as we talk about animals acting like people. And a bunch of other stuff as well. So, I think one of the best examples of animals doing something like people are typically examples of animals talking. That's usually one of the most famous examples of things like that. A lot of times we'll have instances where maybe a animal will make a sound that to us people sounds like the same exact type of verbalage we use. And it's interesting too because when it comes to sounds and verbalage, it's mainly just a large array of sounds. For example, when it comes to that famous video of that dog, that little husky dog where the owners are saying, "Hey, I love you," and the dog replies back with, "Oh, wow, wow, wow." It sounds like it says, "I love you too," and it's really adorable. But the fun thing about that is that the dog seems to have been able to match the number of syllables by his barking, probably because they say it a lot. And he just kind of got into the habit of doing it. So it's definitely interesting that he managed to find the verbalage and the syllables of it, which is definitely interesting to get to hear. And if you haven't seen it, please go watch that really adorable video of this little husky just like sitting there going, "Ow, ow, ow, ow." Like, it does sound just like "I love you too." And that's also a really interesting way that animals can pick up things from people, is that they'll sort of hear something enough, and that they're capable of it. They'll sort of repeat back almost exactly what they hear, or some way of hearing it. But along with that, there's been a more recent video of this cat, this really adorable cat, that as they pointed the camera to it, it sounds like the cat goes, "Well, hi," like a southern lady. And I mean, if you listen to it, yeah, it does sound like that, but in reality it's just a meow that it sounded funny, and that's what makes it funny. That's what makes it really funny and interesting too, is that the meows played perfectly to that syllable and verbalage of sounding like something we hear, because "well, hi" isn't anything special to us people, but hearing a woman from the South saying "well, hi," it was able to match to this cat's funny meow and interesting choice of syllable placement. So that's kind of funny because a lot of dogs and cats don't have the capacity to say words. Rather, they can mimic some sounds, but they don't have the vocal capacity to do all of that. But it's definitely interesting. But animals that do have the capacity to do some of this stuff, specifically with verbalage, are a lot of birds. A lot of birds have the capacity to make noises that mimic a lot of things people do. I spoke in one of my last videos about a specific type of bird, I believe it's the lyre, that actually has the ability not only to imitate other birds by hearing it, but actually imitate some things people do too, or rather sounds that people make. Car alarms, chainsaws, they can imitate things to a specific degree because it's in their sound range. However, some of my favorite birds, the crows or the corvid family, crows, ravens, are smart enough to actually mimic people's speaking. Because instead of, chirping or tweeting or screeching, crows more or less yell with a kind of a caw, caw, which is a very similar sound pattern to people. So a crow going hi is the same as it going ha. So it's kind of interesting that their sound pattern can be very similar to a human's in range. So, and because they're smart enough to actually pick up on sounds, they can mimic it back just as easily. That's why it's so fascinating that animals are able to find this kind of trick, simply due to sound range. Birds have the ability to mimic sounds, other birds, or to be very complex with their verbalage or their sound range, and their sound range is just in the right ballpark to be able to mimic people in that sound range. Now, it's true, a lot of animals do have some kind of communication that we don't completely comprehend or that we don't hear, but they do. But they're able to communicate with us in a different way as well. But they are able to sort of meet us in the middle. Specific animals can actually pull that off. Whereas you'd think that creatures that have a similar vocal or even a similar DNA structure to us would be able to do this. There aren't really many recorded cases of primates having this ability to speak. In fact, one of the most verbal monkeys or primates, like howler monkeys, can make a lot of the same noises we do, but they don't have the ability to grasp speech. So as much as you would like to try and believe, I don't think there's really any reported cases of any primates actually uttering words. Grunts, maybe. Howls, for sure. But it seems that verbal skills aren't quite within their range. Yet birds are, but that's simply because they don't have hands and aren't able to communicate the same way that mammals, specifically, with thumbs and, more variety and movement can do. So it's interesting that a creature that has no hands is able to verbally communicate, but a creature that has hands and a mouth is able to communicate with hands. It's tricky to really comprehend, but it is a really interesting situation in itself. I myself, in my experiences, have spent time with primates, and I did notice how it was interesting how most of them don't make much noise. They do make some hoots and hollers, grunts and growls, but they don't frequently make them enough to have communication. But they do have sort of signage and other things they do as well, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But very rarely will you see this verbalage. Cats, dogs, birds, and there are some other light examples too. But it is interesting how these creatures have the vocal capacity to mimic sounds that people make. They aren't quite on the level of speaking, but they do communicate through some verbalage. And I think it's really cool that they're just able to mimic us just enough to befuddle us and to surprise us and shake our world for a long, long time. I still think about that husky all the time. But it is fascinating. I'm not saying go out of the way to try and make your dog or cat talk like humans, but it is a fun occurrence that can happen if you're fortunate enough to see it. And definitely just speaking with your animal. There's nothing wrong with talking to your animal. I mean, talking to them, not talking at them or yelling at them. And hopefully you might get some kind of interaction between the two of you. But with that being said, we're going to go on a quick break and have some word from our sponsors. But when we come back, we'll talk more about animals that can mimic humans or that try to, or some fun cases of that as well. And we might learn something a little bit interesting as well. But until then, stay tuned.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
On. I hope you guys enjoyed that so far. Today we are talking about animals that act or do things like humans. We just talked about animals that have talked like humans, but what about other ways that they communicate with us just like humans? We're about to continue that right now. So one thing that I mentioned earlier was that primates don't seem to have the vocal capacity to speak in words like humans do. We aren't quite Planet of the Apes level yet, but it is interesting that one thing that primates do have over most animals is that they're capable of learning sign language. So they don't have the verbal skills like birds or even dogs or cats to an extent, but they actually do have the ability to learn verbal skills through hand verbalization. And it's definitely very fascinating because while they can't handle, I guess, the complexity of speaking, they're able to handle the complexity that is speaking through hand gestures, which is actually far more complex. I'm not sure if every primate is capable of this. At least it seems mainly gorillas have the ability to learn this, since that's been most of the recorded emotions of this. One of the best examples, though, is of Koko the gorilla. I'm sure a lot of people know about this one, but if you don't, Koko the gorilla is one of those smartest primates, smartest animals, having the ability to have full conversations in sign language. Also, Koko is known for raising kittens as well, so not only was Koko very, very smart, she was also very kind, but one of the biggest things was that she was actually friends with, beloved actor Robin Williams, and one thing that was very fascinating about her special case was that whenever she was alive, whenever Robin Williams passed, and whenever Robin Williams passed, they informed Koko of that, and she gave the signs for sad, cry, and it was very, very interesting that she was capable of that. She was capable of not only giving recognition of information, but she was also able to give emotion and thought. So that's very fascinating. Sign language is tricky, for sure. I mean, I myself haven't even taken the time to learn it. I've always wanted to, but there are plenty of primates who are capable of this specific ability. Whereas, there are a couple of other animals that have somewhat similar abilities. not many have the ability of sign language, but I do actually recall that there was a dog that was trained to communicate using text-to-speech, not exactly like typing in stuff, but rather the dog's owner actually created a rig of buttons. And when the dog had something it wanted to say, for example, if it was hungry, it would hit one of the buttons that would say food. And then that would mean that hungry, food, I want to eat. So that means it's time to feed, or need to go outside and hit the outside button and stuff like that. And it was a large range of buttons too. It wasn't just like 2 or 3 buttons. It was at least like 5. It was at least maybe 10 buttons. And it was very fascinating that a lot of animals have this ability to be able to communicate through very simple mechanics, but they know what they want. Animals know what they want. They just don't always have the means to convey it. They don't have the means to actually verbalize it or say, I need this, give me this. So the few times it's able to happen is very fascinating. Going back to Coco for a minute and any other animals that have the ability of sign language, my question, I guess more or less my curiosity for a minute here would be, would they be able to have a full conversation with someone fluent in sign language? I wonder how that would actually go down. I don't know if there's any reports of that, but that would actually be really fascinating to see. Would that change the border? Would there be a level of connection? That would honestly be a very interesting study. Someone who's never been able to speak and somebody who can't physically speak, having a conversation like that, what would it be like cross-species conversation? On top of that, there's a couple other interesting things like that as well. Similar to sign language, well, not quite animal, but rather insect. If I remember correctly, bees actually do give a lot of communication by movement. So their buzzing doesn't actually equate to communication, rather it's movement. So they'll actually move in certain directions and patterns that actually convey what their directions are, or what they're supposed to do, or where they're going, because the buzzing isn't their communication. That's just the fluttering or the flapping of their little bitty bee wings. So the fact that we think, oh, they're buzzing, they're angry. No, they're not angry. It means they're active. It means they're moving. That's mainly one of the big things. Unlike ants, who use more of scents and aromas to convey what they're supposed to say, bees use more of actual movements and like shaking, specific twirls and stuff like that. That's actually how they communicate, almost like sign language. I'm not sure how many other insects quite use this, but I know bees are definitely very are very familiar with this one. That's also pretty interesting. You can think of it kind of like interpretive dance if you want, or another type of sign language. But either way, that's probably something you really didn't know. I myself had to look up that fact because a lot of people, especially humans, a lot of people are going to believe that bees are super aggressive and that when they start buzzing, they're angry. Not exactly. I mean, yes, if you agitate them, if you shake the hive, if you do something that will probably get their attention, you'll probably hear a large amount of buzzing. However, that doesn't equate to them being angry. Because if you walk past an active beehive, you'll probably still hear buzzing. That still doesn't mean they're angry. It means they're moving. Because that's how their wings sound. That's how they move. A lot of them together vibrate, and the vibrations, thinking about it, kind of give me the heebie-jeebies. But even still, that's not their communication. Their communication to each other, specifically the queen talking to her drones, is more of a shaking and moving and sort of moving in patterns. The way that she walks around in certain directions is what gives them more specific directions. Now, I'm sure there are also pheromones and smells that are involved as well, but that is one thing that bees do have. So the buzzing doesn't equal angry, it equals movement. Very important to know. I mean, think about it this way. If you see a fighter jet in the sky and you hear it passing you, does hearing the fighter jet past you indicate that the pilot is angry or aggressive at that moment, or does it simply indicate that the fighter jet is moving? In the same regard, the only way to know if they are angry or aggressive or there's something going on is to be able to hear their specific conversations over microphones, which you can't do unless you're part of their network. So it's kind of a interesting way to look at it. But sign language is, I guess it can be universal. I'm more curious as to, would sign language between a gorilla and a human who can't speak, would that work? I'm curious. That's definitely something I want to look more into and really think about. We're already talking about how animals can act like humans and do some things like humans and somewhat communicate like humans, but would that work for humans as well? That's an interesting, very, very interesting way to think about it. Man, I mean, I know that in some cases that there are animals who understand basic commands verbally, but they aren't understanding your words. They're understanding the tone at which you say your words or the sound you hear. It's actually very similar to babies, and that's actually one thing I'm going to talk about coming up, is the level of communication and how it's interpreted. And I actually do have some interesting tips and factoids about that kind of stuff coming up very soon. But in the meantime, we're actually going to take another quick break because my throat's getting a little dry, and we have some words from our sponsors. But until then, as long as you understand my communication, please stay tuned and enjoy this word from our sponsors.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Thanks for sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed those messages. So, as we were previously discussing, a lot of animals have the capacity to understand humans and communicate on a very limited degree. Now, primates seem to be one of the few animals that can actually communicate via sign language, which is very impressive. There are some other minor ways that animals and humans can communicate in a form of sign language, and how we also discussed how bees actually use more of a form of sign language to communicate with each other, and that buzzing actually is not how they communicate, but rather is just mostly the sounds they make. So that's a very fascinating way that humans and animals can communicate and interact. But what are some other ways, and what are other things that we do? Well, believe it or not, there are a few tools and ways that humans can understand how animals are communicating and what they are trying to say. Unfortunately, we don't know their exact words one for one, but there are a few tools and a few ways to actually learn more about how some animals feel. Now, one popular method that a lot of people know is sometimes just based on their facial expressions. Facial expressions can help indicate a way of how animals feel. For example, obviously if an animal is growling at you or snarling at you, then more than likely they're going to be angry at you, which is something that a lot of people will do as well. You can visibly tell on their face how they are feeling and what exactly they're trying to convey to you, which is definitely a useful ability to be able to notice. But if you don't notice this, well, you might need to go and take some classes. But there are a few other ways this has happened. Sometimes they're body language as well, not just facial expressions, but, everyone knows if a cat's arched its back and is, kind of like approaching with caution, yeah, it's probably scared or intimidated. If something curls up next to you, it's probably comfortable. Simple. But there are a few other things that people know about and actually some tools. And this is actually an interesting one based off of maternity. So this one can come and go depending on who you are. So with mothers especially, sometimes fathers too, but mothers tend to know when their baby needs something specific. So if a baby's hungry, then a mother would typically know, they're crying because they're hungry. Or, they're crying because they need to get changed. They're crying because they need attention. It does actually work the same for animals and their offspring, but it actually does work for people and animals communicating. I myself, a longtime pet owner, have been able to use this to really understand what my dog's needs were. So, for example, if my dog was barking usually pretty aggressively or very frequently, he needed out time. However, if he was hungry, he never actually barked for any food. He usually just kind of always looked at me and maybe occasionally would kind of give some indication he was hungry, usually like kind of just getting close to me and getting my attention. So he never actually had to speak for that. And same thing, you start to notice patterns in the way that the animal works. But one thing that actually humans do have that can sort of help with the communication, specifically between household pets, is their barks or meows. They believe it or not, there is tones in the way that they meow that can help you interpret what their specific need is, their mood, or how they feel. So they have advertised different pet translators, which to varying degrees do work, but the bark frequency, how they bark, and what they're barking about actually do convey emotion that is very easy to translate if you've paid attention long enough. So typically, obviously if they're barking very aggressively at something or someone, maybe a growl, usually that indicates some kind of anger or hostility. Whereas, a low bark or a small mutter or whimper means they want something, usually attention or food or maybe even out time. And that's sort of how humans and animals react when it comes to offspring. You just sort of learn how their sounds mean something else. And it's very fascinating, and there are ways to actually monitor these barks if you need a more visual translation. Cats are a little trickier because they aren't always as vocal. Birds, you can't measure every single bird outside, but you can measure their frequency. I personally have also noticed, because there's a lot of birds in my area, I do notice occasionally some things birds are doing, casual tweets to and singing to aggressive to worried, and you just kind of start to notice how they react if you take some time to listen. If you live in the city, you might not have as much luck with this particular way of communication, but it does work if you have the ability to stop and listen long enough to understand what the sounds mean. You'll usually be able to pick up distressed singing from, say, angry or fighting. I mean, I'm hearing some birds tweeting outside my window right now, and they're pretty normal. Sounds like they're just basic communications. A good way to note it is that if a bird is in distress or angry, they'll usually start making noises outside of their usual calm range, usually a lot more louder or frequent. And then if they're, say, very happy, they might sing very more frequently, or they might sing in a more, cohesive or unison. But then when they're afraid, that's really something interesting because it's not even singing anymore. It's more like squawking, and it's interesting. But you start to just kind of pick up and saying, oh, yeah, no, they're fine. Oh, something's bothering them. Keep an eye out for it. There could be a predator nearby. So you just kind of learn based off of what they do, and you're like, okay, there is something happening nearby. It's sort of like when you learn to watch the weather as well. It's really fascinating. There are other things you'll learn about other animals too. Some will make noises. Some make noises you didn't completely understand, but that's probably my favorite way of knowing communication is just listening. If you happen to get to hear animals making noises, when you start hearing them making noises they don't normally make, that's a great chance to get to learn what that noise means. Because like how they learn from us, noises to make that may sound like speaking, the dog saying I love you, the cat saying well hi, and stuff like that. That's them kind of picking up from us, and vice versa. We kind of can pick up how they speak simply by listening long enough and really getting some time to get to understand it. So that's typically just the best thing you can do when it comes to learning about how animals communicate and what it means. It's not too difficult, but it does take some time, and it also requires being around those kind of animals. But it's not that difficult. It's actually a lot of fun when you get the chance to learn it. I'd say if you want to learn right now, especially while we have this time of, hey, we're stuck here, we're doing this, we can't really go anywhere, go sit in your backyard and just listen. Or take a little walk up and down the street. I mean, we're allowed to do that. And just kind of listen to some of the sounds and see if you can hear any birds. Or maybe if you have a dog or a cat, just kind of talk to them more and see what reactions you get and learn what the sounds mean. I'm sure if you own a dog and cat, you might know these things already. But a lot of it does work back and forth between different species of animals. Just some you make noises you probably don't want to hear because it might not be the safest thing to hear that sound. But then again, I don't know how often we all get those chances to hear those sounds. But with that being said, we're going to take another quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the, let's say, negative ways that humans and animals may interact and some of the ways that animals may mimic us that maybe you didn't know weren't exactly good. But until then, please stay tuned from a word from our sponsors.
Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
Once again, we're talking about animals and how they mimic us, and we just previously talked about how animals can communicate very easily through vocal and audio references, and how it really is pretty easy to pick up on that, and how similar our communications really are. Now, I feel it's really important to not only talk about the positives, but the negatives of the mimicry that we give. Now, some animals do indeed mimic humans, or rather have a form of mimicry. But one type of mimicry that is not as flattering or good that we constantly see in media, and this actually does bother me a lot more when I really stop and think about it, simply because it's not good. It's not natural mimicry, rather it's forced mimicry. And sometimes these things can be cute, or they can be interesting, but it's not the best thing for them. One simple one is appearances. Sometimes people like to do things with their animals, particularly dogs or cats, such as changing their appearance. And dogs and cats are domesticated, so it is a bit of a different story. But let's just say you change something about their fur or about their natural colors, or you try to add something to give them more of a style. Sometimes this is okay. This isn't the biggest offender. Sometimes it's something simple like, you want to dress your dog up in your sports team's favorite colors, so you use some non-harmful temporary dyes, whatever. Just be very cautious. Don't let that stuff get into your pet's eye. Along with that, sometimes people try to do things with birds. This is kind of an interesting one because I'm both mixed and I'm kind of mixed on this one. But when it comes to birds, one thing people like to try doing is if it's a singing bird like parakeets or parrots, sometimes they try to teach them songs, or specifically they try to teach them specific tunes that they'll sing. While it's nice that they may pick that up, it also is kind of wrong to try to just teach them songs all the time. But I suppose if it's beyond that, like if someone didn't just buy a bird simply for that one fact, then of course it's okay. But make sure that they understand vocal keys as well, and don't just try to teach them one thing and then wonder why they aren't communicating well because you only taught them one thing. They should also be learning communication. I myself had experience with a avian doctor, and she had a parrot that she was constantly training, and rather than it constantly screaming, which it constantly did, she corrected it and taught it words, and she made it speak a word to make it do something, much like you would teach a toddler. So when it wanted to go up, it actually would say, she'd make it say elevator, and it would go up and down. So while this is cute because it is teaching it something and giving it a form of communication, it's also good for it because it's able to learn how to say something and to get what it wants. Whereas some people just want to teach them songs, and I'm like, that's a cute trick, but what else are you informing or helping this animal learn to survive and to communicate? Because that's the most important factor of it all. Now, out of all of this, I'm going to get into some more that might be a little more uncomfortable and a little more odd or out there. Let's see. I'm trying to think. I don't want to just jump to the big one right now because there are a few other ones. Let's just say, sometimes we try to teach them things like, when it comes to animals like dogs, a lot of times they learn tricks like, go get this, go do that. And that is partly what animals do, but then also the mimicry of, say, how they eat or what they're rewarded with or things like that. Animals can't always eat what we eat. And that's something that a lot of people forget or rather ignore. Some people like to just feed their dogs anything. They like to let their cats just eat wild birds because they're animals. You do need to be cautious with that sort of mentality simply because letting animals try to be like people, especially when it comes to food, is dangerous. Sure, yeah, your dog may be able to sit at the table with you and eat a steak, but it should not be doing that because it's not healthy. It's a pretty dangerous mentality. Sure, you want your dog to be close like family, but there's a reason why they're different species and why they have certain products made for them, because it's made for their health. It's not safe, but it's something every person needs to learn about animals. And the most, the form of mimicry that animals may take from us is probably my least favorite one, and it's adaptive mimicry to be more like people. I don't mind if your dog sits at the table with you. That's whatever. That's how you choose to live with your animal. What I don't particularly care for are people who actually train their animals to walk on two legs. And when I say that, I don't mean, oh, well, my dog just stood up to get to the counter. That's different. Your dog is using its natural abilities to get up to a higher vantage point, or to get more attention, or to see something. That's different. What I'm talking about, there's typically a video that goes around of what looks like a little kid in a onesie running around with a backpack on, and then I see it, and then when it turns around, it's actually a dog. It's a little poodle-like dog running around because someone trained this dog to run on two legs. That is not good. That is not good. And you may also remember some other instances of, say, circus animals, which is already a hot topic, of circus animals, elephants balancing on large balls and stuff like that. That's not good for the animal for many reasons, one of which being it's not good on their body structure, but another one simply being that some of these animals don't have the proper sense of balance or the proper center of gravity for these kind of activities. It can really mess up the body structure of the animal. It can wear down their joints a lot faster. In cases of the elephants, it's not good for them simply because they are such large creatures that they aren't supposed to do big stunts like these because it's not healthy for them. There's a reason why they have 4 very large legs that are supposed to be on the ground. It's not to show off. It's dangerous to try to do these kind of things to some animals, and it actually does really bother me seeing animals do this. You know, sometimes there are cats that will stand on two hind legs to look up. Cats have the motion of their body to be able to do that. They can do that. They don't typically run on 2 legs, but they will stand up on 2 legs because they can, and they do pretty often on their own volition. But when you try getting specifically a dog to stand on 2 legs, or in some instances a larger land mammal like an elephant to balance on something very small like a ball, that's not good. And that's not mimicry anymore. That's just sort of forceful adaptation that's really bad for the animal and a really bad practice for people to get involved in. It's not good for animals. It honestly does make me pretty upset too when I see that sort of thing happen, because it's one thing to have a cute trick. My one of my brothers, he has a dog, a beautiful dog, long legs, and this dog likes to likes to hop on and they'll dance with it. It's cute because it'll hop up on him. And it's not anything wrong with that. They just stand in one place for a second, and he hops back down. But then sometimes he'll also jump into his lap, and they'll hold him like a baby, and he's fine again because they're not forcing him to do anything. They're just holding him funny. But if they were making this dog walk strictly on 2 legs, then I would be very upset by that, and I would have to tell him a lot of things that should not be said around little children. But needless to say, it's not good to do this kind of thing to animals. For the sake of it makes them different or it's a fun trick. It's not good. But with that, I'm going to let you ponder on that for just a moment while we take another quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about one more really cool way that animals do mimic us and why this one's actually the most impressive of them all. Stay tuned.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
are back again. I'm so glad you guys stuck around. So we've been talking about animals and how they mimic us, and the positives and the negatives, and why sometimes these can be good and why they can be bad. But I wanted to shine some spotlight on probably one of the best forms of mimicry that animals take from us. So I think it goes without saying that animals are pretty smart. They're capable of a lot of things we as people aren't, and they're able to do things we wouldn't even expect. Whether it be how some animals able to adapt to certain environments that humans would even find difficult, or maybe it would be how they're able to traverse certain terrains and how resourceful they can be. But I think one of the best resources that animals have taken from us is the ability to use tools. Now that's definitely something that humans have, mastered to a T. But the small amount of animals that have taken advantage of this is pretty amazing. And not only have they taken advantage of it, they use it pretty well, I might add. So, you may think, well, tools. Well, no, animals aren't going to, pick up saws and hammers and, cars and, ladders. No, but they do take what they have around them, and they have used them in ways that are pretty beneficial. If we talk strictly about animals in captivity, there are plenty of primates who have actually, found use in tools, who have found things like toys and have actually mimicked humans in the past. Perhaps it's simple things like, they've actually started using things like rocks or sticks to reach things far away. I remember specifically this one video of it was a monkey specifically, because it did have a tail, that it actually did have a long stick, and it actually did pull in something that someone had dropped beyond its zoo enclosure, simply because it wanted it, and that it got a habit of doing that, taking things that didn't belong to it. Along with that, other simple things. You may think, well, a monkey or a primate hitting something with a rock isn't that special. Well, to you it might not be, but it's pretty smart. Oh, I can't get inside this thing. I hit it with this thing that's harder and get this thing, rather than trying to rip it open or trying something else. And it saves them time. On top of that, I think one of the more fascinating things is how some of them even get food through it. I already mentioned the really long stick and how they could just sort of reach for something far away. But what about getting food that it can't get immediately on the surface? And rather than using so much energy, all it does is take a simple stick, dip it in the ground, and there you go. It's got food. Now, they don't quite fish, but they do kind of scoop around for insects. Because, yes, primates do eat insects. Some of them in the wild do. And using them to sort of scoop out bugs is a very simple practice that they've taken very frequently. But what about other types of tools or interesting things? Well, in captivity, to help assess the intelligence of primates, they actually do have a sort of weight test where they sort of move things around in a puzzle. And a lot of primates, and even canines and cats and stuff, have actually taken advantage of tools and puzzles and toys that help them learn and grow, especially with communications. Learning how to use buttons to reward them with food. Learning how to use a lot of things, specifically that teach them more about the broader world, and how they don't have to simply forage, but they actually can get food through simple actions. I also think one of my favorites is definitely crows. Crows are very intelligent, and like I said, they know puzzles well. They know ways around puzzles. One of my favorites was there was this really cool box that if the crow wanted the food that was floating on a small amount of water inside this box, it couldn't reach in and grab it, and it couldn't do anything. So what it would do was it would take little pieces to the box and drop it into the water. That would then cause the water to rise a little bit more because of weight distribution. So it would take a few of them until the water rose high enough for it to just simply scoop the food right off the top, which is very smart because it's not only using it's not only learning the puzzle, it's using its resources to get something it needs and show just how smart it was. I mean, sometimes you'd have to think how much thought would a human be able to put into that sort of thing. On top of that, another crow actually did something similar where in a different type of box, it couldn't reach the food all the way inside of it, but what it did was it found a sort of little metal stick, and it used that metal stick to slide the piece of food out, because it was like, oh, I could just use this stick and scoop it around. And some animals have the capacity to learn those simple tasks and techniques using tools and basic common logic, simply because they have the ability to. They learn through testing, through playing. Animals aren't as simple as you think. On top of that, there have been other animals that are able to do a lot of things like, put different shaped items in holes and stuff like that, and they learn. They are very capable of learning if given the chance. However, in the wild, they're not going to get as many of these chances, but they are very easy and quick to adapt, much like people are. The only thing that's different is the level at which they can adapt or need to adapt. People need to adapt quickly because the level at which they use a lot of their abilities is much higher, and they need to have a certain level to be able to thrive. Whereas animals can survive off of much less, and anything else is just completely surprising. I definitely think another really good example of animals being smart are animals that are able to do things like I've seen birds who are capable of actually outsmarting people on occasion, simply because they wanted something, such as this one bird that actually managed to steal a plate of food. Or it would steal stuff from humans by pretending that it wanted something else. It would take something from them, then throw it on the ground, and then when the human went to pick it up, it automatically went back and got what it really wanted. So I like to think that not only are these animals smart, but they are just as intelligent as us where it counts, if we were to scale. And it definitely is pretty interesting how much they're able to learn, depending on their environments. City birds will probably learn how to be city smart. Jungle birds will probably learn how to be jungle smart. And it's definitely really fun to compare them and see how much different these animals compare, and how much they might learn from us. And that's truly fascinating. It really is amazing with what they'll pick up. Even some sea life. I've already mentioned octopi able to use human tools or use tools in general, picking up things like coconut shells or empty clam shells to hide from predators, to imitate other animals. It's definitely amazing what can happen, especially if you observe them long enough. So one thing, again, I recommend today is definitely, if you get the chance, go check out your local nature institute. If you have an aquatic nature institute, like an aquarium or anything like that, definitely take a trip out there. I know right now things are definitely difficult. You can actually probably see a lot of videos or even live cams of animals, nature institutes, aquariums, if you go look it up, and that's definitely something you can do right now. Being stuck indoors, it's definitely not fun. Just because you're confined to home and also required to be socially distant doesn't mean that you can't take some time to go and take a walk and just listen to the animals. You might actually be able to hear them better right now too. But that's just kind of how things are right now. I know it's difficult, but thankfully, animals have aren't affected by the virus, and that's good. Take a little walk if you can, at a safe distance. Make sure that you are being respectful of other people and staying healthy. And definitely keep an eye out and just see what you can learn from animals. But we're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we're just going to kind of wrap this all up in a nice bow and hopefully learn how well animals really do relate to us. But until then, here's a quick word from our sponsors.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Today, guys. I'm hoping you enjoyed today. So we've been talking about animals and their amazing ability to mimic us and the goods and bads, the pros and cons of them taking on those responsibilities and attributes of us people. So as we've been talking today, animals do have a tendency to sort of follow what we do, and they even take attributes after us depending on how much they interact with us, and how they actually do a lot of the similar things we do. Some animals, a lot of primates, are actually able to follow with sort of hand signs and sign language to be able to communicate and actually have whole conversations. Some animals are able to actually verbalize words and sound almost identical to humans, and even if anything imitate us. And it's actually really fascinating. Some through movement, and some through their very limited speech and vocal patterns are able to communicate in a very similar fashion to us as well. Sometimes motions speak louder than words speak louder than motion, but animals do have their own complex ways of communicating that we as people don't completely grasp simply because we don't speak that language. But just because we don't speak the same language or communicate the exact same way doesn't mean that we don't have the ability to communicate. I've definitely talked about how animals are a lot smarter than we give them credit for at times. And there are simple ways you can observe this. I as I always say, take some time and go look at your local institute or aquariums, even insectariums, are great ways to go and learn more about animals. You'll get to learn and experience some, and that's definitely the best kind of place you can go to talk to an expert. I myself am not an expert, but I do have experience with animals, and they're not threatened by people all the time. They can be threatened by people very easily, but that's only dependent on how the people approach them. And, of course, give them space, just like with any person. And I think that's definitely one last thing that animals do sort of not even take from us, just that one thing we have in common is social constructs. We may not have exact same social constructs, but we do have a lot of similar ones. Animals tend to stick with their kind simply because while animals that are similar may have some ways to communicate, animals tend to stick with their kind simply because they are in a safer, more familiar environment. And that's something that a lot of people can relate to. People who are sporty might stick with the sportier people. People who are, more academically inclined might do the same. But even then, animals do also have a lot of ways they communicate in their different rankings as well. They might have animals who have a class system. They might have animals who have a competitive monarch system. They have different ways that in some ways do parallel our own, but they communicate all the same. It's understood. They don't need to speak. They don't need to do sign language. It's all understood. And a lot of times that happens through our society as well. And I think the main difference simply is that one species is trying to survive while another species is simply living, and this is the sort of things we adopt from them, or that we sort of have instituted in our living. So it's important to keep in mind that the ways to communicate, don't always need to be intricate. Sometimes it's just simple and understood stuff. Animals will fight for dominance, and believe it or not, humans do that just as frequently too. Did they take that from us, or did we take that from them? That's the question there. But animals are smart. Animals survive, and animals will find ways to adapt. However, it doesn't mean we need to force adaptation and change on them. Rather, we need to respect what they have and not try to force them out of what they do. If an animal is intelligent enough to learn and has the opportunity to learn new skills, then that's definitely something that is admirable. But if an animal is being forced to learn new skills through human interference simply due to, this is something that they should totally do, or it would be cool if they could do that, I think you're looking at the mimicry and adaptation in the wrong light. We as people shouldn't be interfering with animals and their natural lifestyle too much. Domesticated animals, pets, dogs, cats, etc., have a different rap, but even then, they still do have a certain way of doing things. Whereas animals that live in the wild, animals that have been rescued and rehabilitated, do have a different way to live at things, and sometimes those animals that have been rehabilitated and rescued do have different opportunities that other animals in the wild won't get. But even then, it's not simply to say you're different. It's more or less to give an opportunity and to learn more about them. So a lot of times the things that we learn animals can pick up aren't simply because we're trying to get them to learn a fancy new trick, but rather it's to learn more about the capabilities of animals and to really get to observe them. And that's what's important. Observing, learning, getting to spend time and really get to understand the animal. Just like being around someone you want to be around. You learn more about them. You learn what they're good at. You learn what their personality's like. Because animals of all shapes and sizes have personality. They have personality, they have individualities, they have unique skills about themselves and things that no one would know about unless they look closer to. And it's really important to understand that about animals, simply because just because two animals are of the same species does not mean that they will react and act the exact same way. And I think that's one thing that we don't consider enough about. Animals may pick up some traits from humans, but they shouldn't be forced human traits simply because it seems cool to us. I respect animals too much to try to force something like that on them. As much as I think it could be cool to see a parrot talk, or to see to see a gorilla doing sign language, if it's not necessary, if it's not something that they naturally need to know, or if it's not necessary, it's not something I feel that would need to happen, nor do I need to see. I think it's very amazing when it can happen, but it doesn't need to happen. It's more or less, let whatever happens, happens. But that's just simply how I view things, that's my opinions on that matter. But it is important to respect animals and the way they live, and to make sure that we don't try to put too many odd constructs. I mean, if you've seen Planet of the Apes, you know what happens, and I don't think we're ready for that yet. I'm joking, but either way, that is something to remember. But as always, I say, definitely take some time to go and learn. Take a trip outside, listen to the voice of the animals, just see how they react, and just take some time to really get to understand animals, because understanding and learning is one of the most important things you can ever do. But like always, I'd like to thank you for listening to the GSMC Pets Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you like what you heard today, please consider subscribing and giving a like. Also, leaving a comment below really helps us out. And if you'd also like to, you can follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'd like to thank you for listening today, and as always, have a great day, guys.
You've been listening to the GSMC Pets Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.